Welcome back to the book club. I'm Michael Knowles. It has all led to this. This entire show has led to this moment. I was excited for it. I was dreading it. I have picked up this book multiple times in my life, and until this show made me finish it, I had failed. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. We had to bring in a heavy hitter for this one. We brought in Sir Niall Ferguson, a former professor at Harvard. We don't have to talk about that too much. The author of many books, the giver of many lectures, and a man really who needs no introduction. Niall, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Michael. It's great to be here.
On this show, I ask the guest to give a 1-minute summary of the books. If anyone can do it, it's you, but I won't hold it against you if you go to 62 seconds.
The plot of War and Peace is in fact quite straightforward. It is about the war between France and Russia that Napoleon Bonaparte starts. And that culminates in 1812 with the French invasion of Russia. The real point of the book is the way in which this huge geopolitical shock affects the lives of a group of aristocratic Russian families. The central character, Pierre, experiences a whole series of philosophical illuminations in the course of the novel. The point of the book is how war affects the lives of ordinary people. Not that the aristocrats in the book are ordinary, but it's really the interaction between the war and their lives, particularly their love lives, that really make War and Peace the greatest novel ever written.
And as you say, a lot of the action focuses on the aristocrats, but it's not only the aristocrats. You also get some of the serfs who crop up there, some of these religious figures. Freemasons show up. You've got people from Russia and Austria and Prussia and Germany and France. And it occurred to me, maybe about halfway through, a third of the way through, I said, oh, this book really is about everything, which I should have known because the title is War and Peace. That's pretty much all there is.
Right.
So even when you mention the historical aspect of it, it's hard to call it a novel, even though it's the greatest novel ever written, because you're reading it, and then all of a sudden you get to a chapter, and it's an essay just about history.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you get to a chapter, and it's a treatise on religion, or on Freemasonry, or he even delves into mathematics a little bit. And it's just everything.
In many ways, it's a Bildungsroman, to use the German term. It's a novel in which an education happens. And it's the education principally of the central character, Pierre, who goes from being a worshipper of Napoleon, or at least an admirer of Napoleon at the beginning, to seeing through Napoleon. He's a Freemason along the way. He ultimately arrives at a new understanding of life. And the book culminates with an essay on free will and determinism, the central essay of the philosophy of history, in my view. So the way to read War and Peace is as an education. You will be educated.
Yeah.
There are about 24 chapters that are purely philosophical, and they pop up in the midst of the human drama of the Rostovs and the other families that you get to know. There's a large cast of characters, which makes it challenging, but as long as you are careful and keep track of the key characters, who are Pierre, Prince Andre, and Natasha, you'll be fine. And they're so brilliantly realized as characters, and their complex entanglements are so movingly described that you'll be caught up in that human drama. And you'll almost welcome the moments when Tolstoy pops up and says, well, what does this all mean? Is Napoleon the Antichrist? I mean, that's a great moment when Pierre starts to think that actually that's who Napoleon is.
Yes.
And he then decides he has to assassinate Napoleon to save the world. So the book is a kind of everything book, as you've said, Michael. It's all there. And if you were a man, you like the war chapters better, and if you're a woman, you like the peace chapters. But my wife and I were discussing that the other night. But you have got to read it all, because all life is there, and I can assure you the size should not intimidate you. I think it's entirely gripping. I think I've read it 3 times. I first encountered it when I was 15, growing up in Scotland. It's the reason I became a historian. That book is the reason that I did what I decided to do, because it's all there. And at the end of it, you are suddenly confronted with the big question: what is the historical process? What is the power that moves nations? Is Tolstoy's great question at the end. Why did this all happen? Why did the French invade Russia? Why was there all this slaughter? And why did ordinary people's lives get turned upside down? And that is the big question.
Yes. To your point on don't let this intimidate you, as someone who had tried multiple times to pick it up, I was recently talking to Rich Lowry, editor of National Review, and while I was reading this, and he said, well, Michael, the thing that you're going to find is it's such a slog to really get started, to really get into it. And by the end, you're not going to want it to end. And I found that certainly to be true. It's probably the greatest novel I've ever read, because it's probably the greatest novel ever written. And as you just mentioned, by the time you get, in my copy, to page 1274, Epilogue Part 2, you finally get the question that Tolstoy is after. What force moves the nations? So, what force moves it? Is it the great men, as was a popular conception in the 19th century, these individual heroes? Is it just kind of tides of culture that we can't quite pin down? Is it, as Tolstoy points out, what we used to think it was, which is God and divine providence? Where does the story come from?
Well, Napoleon thinks it's him. And Napoleon is in many ways the villain of the piece. Napoleon's egotism, his belief that he issues commands and a vast army forms and invades Russia, is the target of Tolstoy's argument. Because Tolstoy wants to show that although Napoleon appears to be in command of these events, he's not really. And he's vain, egotistical, cynical. In reality, something more powerful is at work. But you're on a journey to realize that history is not about great men. In truth, it's about ideas. It's about the interaction of vast impersonal forces. And because all the different protagonists, all the different characters are taking decisions about their own lives, history is the sum of all those decisions. The decisions on the part of the French soldiers to accept the mission to invade Russia, the decision on the part of ordinary Russians like the peasant that Pierre befriends to resist the Russian onslaught. That's the historical process. And Tolstoy's conclusion is that it's a delusion that someone like Napoleon has the will to initiate such enormous events. In truth, something that no individual controls is at work.
So then does anything distinguish Napoleon? In other words, Tolstoy could have written about any period he wanted to. There have been wars throughout all of history. What makes Napoleon so special? What makes Napoleon so special for this question? You know, also here in the essays at the end, Tolstoy points out this apparent paradox, which is that Napoleon is a child of the French Revolution, and yet Napoleon, as the flower of the French Revolution, undermines the French Revolution. He actually suppresses the revolution. So why him? Why now? Why this war? Why would Tolstoy devote his great work to this historical event in particular?
Tolstoy himself was born sometime after Napoleon's defeat. In 1828, Napoleon was ultimately defeated in 1815. The events that are described in the book happened roughly 50 years before publication. So it's a little bit as if you, Michael, decided to write a novel set at the time of the Vietnam War. That's important because it's not so distant that it's completely remote from us. It's not the Peloponnesian War. It's sufficiently near that you could have a conversation with older relatives who might have had a first-hand experience of the Vietnam War.
There's a Count Tolstoy in the novel.
And indeed, Tolstoy's father, whom he did not know well because he died when Tolstoy was quite young, had served in the war. So that sort of helps you get a sense of the distance between the author and the events. They're not that remote. They're as close to him as Vietnam is to us. And I think part of what's going on here is a reckoning a generation later with the ideas that had been so hotly debated at the time and were still being debated in Russia in the 1860s. Ideas about politics, how democratic should a society be, or should there be an absolute ruler as Napoleon had become? That was the central debate that had gone on in France beginning with the revolution, and it had been resolved with the utter failure of the revolutionary project and the emergence of Napoleon as an authoritarian absolutist ruler. But because Tolstoy was somebody deeply engaged with religious and philosophical questions, he writes War and Peace before his transformation into a kind of Christian fundamentalist pacifist, but he's on a journey in that direction. The book is also about ethical and religious questions as well as about the political questions. And I think it's sort of more a philosophical book than a political book. And what's wonderful is that Tolstoy gives us philosophy by examples.
Yeah.
He allows us to see the fundamental conundrums, the dilemmas of the human condition, but with clear and concrete examples and with people you can identify with. Pierre, who's intelligent but somewhat self-indulgent, doesn't have great self-discipline, is sort of a wandering scholar trying to find truth and frequently taking wrong turnings. He's also trying to find love. He's trying to find social acceptance. So he's the sort of anchor character. And then there's the more noble and admirable figure of Prince Andre, who's also on a kind of journey.
Yeah.
So each character is confronted with the problem. The problem is that war is coming, or war is actually raging. And how will you act? What is your role going to be in these world historical events that you can't control?
So you have these two characters you've just mentioned, Pierre and Prince Andre. And there's this wonderful contrast between them because Pierre is an illegitimate child of Count Bezhikov, and he thinks that his father doesn't even want to see him. He's kind of a rascal and gets up to all sorts of trouble. But as the Count is dying, he leaves his whole estate to Pierre. So all of a sudden now, Pierre is Count Bezhikov, and all the other kids are angry about this. And he's raised up, and society treats him a lot better. And then you have Prince Andre. And about halfway through the novel, they meet up again. And this is after Pierre has come out of his childish ways, and he thinks he's found this path of enlightenment and self-discipline through Freemasonry and the brotherhood of man. And he encounters Prince Andre, who's been in the war already. He's been disabused of his illusions. He's now just going to live for himself. He doesn't care whatsoever about the serfs or equality or anything like that. He's just going to serve himself. And they have this big debate in the middle of the novel. And when they leave, Pierre says, I'm going to free my serfs, and I'm going to improve the lot of mankind and the common man. And as always happens in debates like this, they leave and they don't agree. But secretly, Pierre has convinced Prince Andre. And then the irony is, Pierre goes about trying on his happy, clappy humanitarian plans. Totally fails, just doesn't know how to really affect anything. Prince Andre quietly starts to put Pierre's ideas into practice. So you're seeing the role of ideas on the movement of people and political events, but in rather different ways. You're seeing one walking the walk, one just sort of talking the talk. Just to give people a little bit of context, we keep talking about these families. Who are the families? We open up the novel and they're at a nice sort of cocktail soiree, and you have a number of different families who kind of show up, and they're all trying to get favors from one another and marry the daughters off to each other. So who are they?
So social context is hugely helpful here. The Russian aristocracy at the time that the novel is set own not only vast tracts of land, but they own people. There's a big difference between unfree labor in the United States and unfree labor in 19th century Russia, namely that everybody's white. But the serfs are in all respects unfree. They don't have freedom. They are bound to the land. And the aristocracy own very large numbers of serfs as well as large tracts of land. And they live this strange life, which Tolstoy's short stories depict very well. They have their grand residences in the country, as Tolstoy's family did, not too far from Moscow, about 100 miles from Moscow. And they spend some of their time there, but they spend more time in the two big cities that still to this day dominate Russian life. St. Petersburg, the fashionable, westward-oriented political capital since the time of Peter the Great, and Moscow, which has reverted to being the capital in the last 100 years since the Russian Revolution. So they have this double life. Part of their time is spent in the city. We see a lot of that. The social life of St. Petersburg, the glamorous social life of St. Petersburg. And then there is this sort of period of your time when you're in the country, miles from anywhere, miles from anybody, surrounded by the unfree laborers who work the land. By the time that Tolstoy is writing War and Peace, this great problem has been resolved by the emancipation of the serfs, which is the great legislative achievement of Tsar Alexander II. But at the time that the novel's set, that's still a very distant prospect. So we're dealing here with a highly unequal society. That's why it's very important that at a very low point in his fortunes at the Battle of Borodino, shortly before he's taken prisoner, Pierre has an encounter with an ordinary Russian serf, a peasant.
Katyaev.
That's right. Who is the person that he's most impressed by because of his authenticity, his simplicity, and his sincerity. And Tolstoy increasingly romanticized the ordinary Russian. But in his young life, he felt so conflicted as a serf owner that he tried the kind of reforms that Pierre and Andre are talking about. There's a funny short story that Tolstoy also wrote describing the kind of failure of an idealistic landowner who tries to, as it were, preemptively emancipate his serfs, tries to educate them, tries to uplift them, but it doesn't work, because there's just too big a cultural gap between the educated, westernized aristocrat and the illiterate peasant farmers that he owns. And this is a really important moment of connection where the huge social chasm that separates a landowner from a serf is bridged by the crisis of the war.
Well, one thing I love about Katyaev is, I'll work on it before we get to War and Peace 2, is you see different modes of knowledge cropping up throughout the story. So there's scientific knowledge, there's philosophical knowledge, there's Hermetic, Gnostic, Freemason knowledge, there's historical knowledge. And then my favorite is the mode of knowledge that this serf engages in, which is folk sayings. He's always uttering these little folk sayings, which are very charming and which really do, especially if you're a conservative, really do convey a lot of very important wisdom about how societies operate.
The central question in 19th century Russia was, should we be like the West Europeans? They were educated like West Europeans, hence they speak French, and conversation in St. Petersburg is within the elite, more likely in French than in Russian. Or should we be Slavs? Should we be true to our East European Orthodox traditions?
Yeah.
And Tolstoy is preoccupied with this question. So is Dostoevsky. So is Turgenev. It's the big debate of the mid-19th century Russian elite. And it's there in War and Peace. It's obviously deeply problematic for the Russian elite to be fighting the French. They have much more in common with the French elite than they have in common with the Russian serfs. But part of what you see in the book is the behavior of the French army, their brutality, the shooting of prisoners, which is a very important moment in the book, the burning of Moscow. All of this signals that there is something wrong with this French culture that you've been raised to admire. And when you encounter the plain people of Russia, the ordinary serf, you encounter some authentic human values that are fundamentally different from the ideas that have animated the French Revolution and then animated the creation of an empire.
There's one line on this very point that strikes me as quite pertinent to our politics today, which is somewhere around the first third of the book, I guess. Anna Pavlovna, one of these society women characters, says, "Ah, mon cher vicomte, l'Europe ne sera jamais notre allié sincère. Europe will never be our sincere ally." That takes me right back to 2025. Right. Something tells me Vladimir Putin has read this book once or twice.
I think it's highly likely, since reading War and Peace is like learning to play chess. You're not an educated Russian if you can't do those things. And it's that another reason, if you need another reason to read War and Peace, is to be reminded of that constant perennial struggle over the bloodlands, to use Timothy Snyder's term, that separate Western Europe from the Russian Empire. The war that's raging still in Ukraine after more than 3 years is a war being fought over territory that the French army marched through on its way to Moscow, and then what was left of it marched back through it on the return, the return to France. So it's a book that feels even more relevant. I hate that word, but more worthy of our interest today than it did when I first read. I mean, I first read the book, I guess, in the 1970s. The Cold War was still going on. It felt like the Iron Curtain was a permanent feature of our lives. But with war raging in these same areas, with air raids happening on some of the cities that feature in the novel, War and Peace really resonates.
And you keep seeing alliances change as this tension works its way out. So one of the great moments of the novel is when you've got Napoleon as a criminal. He really has no legitimacy. It was considered totally ridiculous for the Tsar to meet with Napoleon. He sends a deputy to go meet with Napoleon. And, but then after this common criminal has won some battles, all of a sudden there's this moment when Napoleon and the Tsar meet and they exchange honors with each other. They give honors to each other's officers. Now they're all sort of friends. And then that doesn't last very long. Obviously, Napoleon goes on to invade Moscow. And then Napoleon is not only a common criminal, he becomes the Antichrist. And previously, you've got alliances between Russia and Austria and Germany. But the Russians don't like those people either. And there are all sorts of tensions. And then at one point, they're waiting for the Russian army, one half of it, to kill the other half of the Russian army. So you've got this constant shifting, which is paralleled in the social lives of these aristocrats, where these cute little girls who they come out at their debutante balls and they instantly fall in love with these young men. We'll be together forever. Once the war is over, we're going to get married. And then they all fall in love with different people and then they kind of return. And there's this, it just feels like this wave that is ebbing and flowing for 1,400 pages.
I think anybody of the generation that went through World War II will recognize the way in which the disruption of war brings the disruption of love. Relationships in wartime are different from relationships in peacetime because there's some non-trivial probability that the men won't come back. There's also the way in which the war affects the sensibilities of couples. They're changed by events. So part of what's exciting about War and Peace, and this is important for people who feel at this point alienated. Oh no, it's about battles. It's about war. This is not my thing. It's also about love. And it has one of the great moments, in the history of literature, which is Pierre's first encounter with Natasha. Now, this for me is an extraordinarily important moment because it's the coup de foudre. They see one another at a ball, one of these wonderful events that the book describes, and it is the moment of connection. In the Soviet movie version, which I highly recommend,
it's 7 or 8 hours long or something.
Really faithful to the book. If you want to see a movie that is truly faithful to the novel, see Bondarchuk's War and Peace.
Hold on, you're telling me instead of spending weeks reading this book. I could have just watched the movie.
No, you have to do both.
Got it.
First read the book, and then, and it's like having just Turkish delight for dinner. You watch the movie, and the movie's great because it's so faithful to the book. The battle scenes, incidentally, are insanely good because they had the entire Red Army available. Many, many horses perished to the outrage of Western animal rights activists. But the moment when Pierre sees Natasha is brilliantly realized by Bondarchuk, who plays Pierre himself as well as directing the movie. But that moment when you see the person that you're destined to marry, and you know and they know, is the most important moment that human life can give you, and it's there in War and Peace. Now, of course, it takes a very long time for Pierre and Natasha to be united. In fact,
some marriages in the meantime.
Starcross doesn't even cover it. Pierre has a miserably unhappy marriage to somebody he knows he's making a mistake marrying. Natasha gets mixed up with a very bad character indeed, and so there's lots and lots of love in War and Peace, which is why when Woody Allen makes his parody, Love and Death, that's the title he gives it. And I also recommend that you watch Love and Death after you've watched Bondarchuk's War and Peace, because Love and Death is very, very funny. But it's not funny if you have never read War and Peace.
So you mentioned these, well, Pierre is a little bit older, I guess, but you're mentioning all these young people before the war breaks out. They're all at balls. They're all kind of falling in love. And one of the characters, a secondary character, is Rostov. And Rostov is in love with Sonia, so the other little girl. And they're going to get married, or they want to, but they're cousins, so it's kind of tricky. But Rostov, he doesn't know anything. I mean, he really is a boy. And then he says, all right, Sonia, I'll see you later, because I got to go off to the war now, and I'm going to become a man in the war. And my favorite line, there are many, many lines that I underlined and dog-eared, but my favorite line in the whole book is when Rostov is in battle, and he's off his horse now, and he's looking at these people, and he says, who are they? Why are they running? Can they be coming at me? And why? To kill me? Me, who everybody loves? And then he thinks of his mother's love for him, and he thinks of all these wonderful, beautiful events in his life. And I thought, I've never been in battle. Maybe I would have the same thought. That realization, wait a second. Why would they want to kill little old me?
Tolstoy had seen action in the Crimean War and had written some very excellent short stories about that experience. I think it's one of the things that makes War and Peace work, is he knows what it's like to be in that extraordinary situation that there are people trying to kill you and you have no idea who they are. Yeah. So War and Peace is good because the war stuff is done really well by somebody who knew whereof he wrote, but he also did his homework. This is a historical novel. Now, some historical novels I tend to warn people against because they're so completely divorced from historical reality. Tolstoy did his homework. War and Peace is a very thoroughly researched book. The historical parts and real historical figures, not only Napoleon, but others feature in the book. They're done really well. And so you're not getting kind of bad history here. You're getting very carefully researched history, but then you also get this human insight in the battle scenes. There's a fantastic moment, one of my favorites in the book, when it looks as if Prince Andre's dead.
Yep.
And he's lying on the battlefield. But his apparently final act has been to run forward, holding the standard. And he's lying there prostrate with the standard beside him. And Napoleon rides up and utters the immortal line, "Quelle belle mort." What a beautiful death. I have always been haunted by that moment. That Andre's barely conscious, but he's aware.
Until he starts twitching.
Yeah.
He says, that one's still alive.
Yeah. So yes. He survived, but is gravely ill, goes through this process of convalescence, but he's altered by the experience. They all are altered by the war. And that's, I think, the critical point. All of the vacillations of their private lives, the intrigues, the affairs, the broken engagements, the broken hearts, are resolved at the end in a way that's powerfully moving. I suppose when I read it first, I came to the somewhat banal conclusion that when all is said and done, your grand philosophical schemes are as nothing compared with the simple pleasures of domestic happiness. Tolstoy was not himself domestically happy.
Yeah. That's putting it mildly.
I think he had one of the unhappiest marriages of all time.
Didn't he die fleeing his wife, basically, on a train or something?
They had a tremendously troubled relationship. The best illustration of how this wasn't going to work out was that on the eve of their wedding, Tolstoy gave his wife Sonia his diaries, which described all of his sexual escapades, including the serf woman he'd impregnated and had a child by. This wasn't a great start to the marriage. Then Tolstoy was a kind of workaholic who expected her to be his amanuensis, to provide all the kind of secretarial support that he required. It was not a happy relationship. But this, of course, is why Tolstoy's so good at unhappiness, but also sees the ideal as domestic bliss.
You're reminding me, too, of a parallel here between Tolstoy's life and Pierre, which is that Pierre marries this awful woman and she cheats on him. She might have cheated on him with her. Well, she might have had a sexual relationship with her brother, Anatole, and she cheats on him with this guy, Dolokhov, who's a complete scoundrel.
There are lots of real in the book, really great characters, which is another reason for reading War and Peace. The loathsome people are really worth loathing.
They're great. I mean, they're like, and Dolokhov then later goes on and rips off Rostov and a gambling debt ruins him.
Rostov is the nice guy, by the way. You mentioned him. He's the kind of nice guy who just kind of wants to get by, but he's broke. Yeah. He's the nice broke guy with the too many children. We've all met Rostov.
But even when Pierre realizes Dolokhov is mocking him because he's been sleeping with his wife, they have a duel.
A duel is a very important moment.
It's an amazing moment because you're waiting for Pierre, who has apparently never picked up a firearm in his life. He's asking, he's trying to play it cool. He says, and how does this trigger work on here? You know, but he wins the duel. He takes him out. But that doesn't resolve it for him. And eventually he ends back up with this awful woman after some time apart. But he doesn't want to sleep with her. And his Freemason guide, his guru, tells him, he says, you've got to do the marital act. And I'm reminded of Tolstoy, who I believe one of the causes of his marital unhappiness, he also would not sleep with his wife.
The role of sexual frustration in history is a very important and understudied one. I think War and Peace is also about love. It's about relations between men and women, and one sees them in all their different facets.
So you're pointing out here this tension, or maybe just complementarity, between the grand philosophical schemes, the philosophy of history, and the quotidian aspects of all the lives of these particular people. Reading Tolstoy, not just War and Peace, but reading Tolstoy's broader works, one gets the impression that this guy really just wants to be a philosopher. Yeah. And I think there was even a letter from Turgenev saying, cut it out with all the philosophy, just stick to the novels. You're really, really good at novels. Yeah. And it's almost like Tolstoy's living the dream, but not his dream. He just happens to be the greatest novelist ever. Yeah. But that's not really what he wants to do. Yeah. His true passion is philosophy.
I think what's great about the book is precisely the way that it interweaves philosophy and the human drama, the human comedy. As I said, the reason this book turned me into a historian was that I thought I ought to really be a physicist, because that was what my mother did, and that seemed like the cleverest thing. And what Tolstoy taught me was that really the study of humanity was more challenging, because humanity is particles with consciousness as opposed to just particles. So War and Peace is about particles with consciousness. The reason its scale is so vast is that, unlike most novelists who essentially paint in micro, Tolstoy gives us macro. He gives us the vast canvas of the Napoleonic Wars. And then the human experience is where you zoom in Prince Andre on the battlefield. I love the philosophical chapters.
Yeah.
I know I'm in the minority
No,
there. I'm probably one of the few people you'll ever meet who's read the second epilogue. And I'm probably the only person you know who thinks it's the best part of the book. But if you just read it cold, if you just took the philosophical chapters and the epilogue out and only read those, then it would not be as powerful.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't even strike you as particularly brilliant philosophy.
No.
So you actually need both. And Turgenev was right. Tolstoy's genius is that he realizes the human condition and he makes us understand what it is to be Prince Andre, to be Pierre, even to be Natasha. For somebody who ought not to be good at writing women, he does, I think, a pretty good job. So he's not a philosopher any more than I was going to be a physicist. But I try and write history with at least some sense of the scientific context. And Tolstoy's doing philosophy while being a brilliant novelist.
I, like many men, it's not just me, I don't love reading novels. When I get into it, then I'm into it, whatever. But I much prefer reading history or philosophy. And so I was told I was going to hate the philosophical and historical chapters. And I really liked them. And I felt more comfortable with them even. But I agree. I wouldn't want to read a book of them. That's not what makes this special. There's one, though, that struck me also, which is he starts talking about the continuity of motion. He says absolute continuity of motion is not comprehensible to the human mind. So we like to divide things up into it was this, they're separate, we're compartmentalizing them. But he says, by adopting smaller and smaller elements of motion, we only approach a solution to this problem. We never reach it. Only when we have admitted the conception of the infinitely small and the resulting geometrical progression with a common ratio of 1/10. What kind of language is this for a novel? And have found the sum of this progression to infinity, do we reach a solution to the problem? He says, to understand the laws of this continuous movement is the aim of history. In other words, you can't even just talk about the Napoleonic Wars because human history is this continuous motion of all these various segments that really can only be understood together.
And it's almost as if Tolstoy is envisioning a movie. He's envisioning the slicing of action into still photographs that are then shown in a seamless continuum. That's the kind of thing that I find exciting about the book, that he's willing to suddenly delve into the abstract before returning to the love affairs of Russian aristocrats. I mean, why is it that one is moved by these distant fictional love affairs? I think it's because as you're reading about them, you know that you're being educated about something much, much larger, much, much grander in its scope.
And in fact, he's telling you that. Just in case you get confused, I am teaching you something about this. And it's funny also to think about the importance of ideas for him as he's telling this history, because then later on in the epilogues, he'll say, listen, when we try to approach history, some people say it's the great men, some people say it's the intellectuals, and so if you want to trace history, you just figure out which books were written when. So, by the way, there's no evidence that the books that were written at a particular time ever actually really seep down to control the actions of the great mass of people. So he starts to undercut that, and yet he's obviously presenting it here. I wonder, and I keep coming back to it because it was such a jarring part of the novel to me. Why the Freemasonry? I mean, when Pierre is going through it and he's going to come out of his dereliction, why is it this Josip, this Freemason guru, pops in unannounced and he says, I've got a solution to your problem?
It seems strange to you now because Freemasonry is much less important than it used to be. But if I were to take you back to the American founding, the key figures in the founding were Masons, and the Masonic lodges were extremely important in the social organization of the American Revolution through the 19th century.
So much so that there was an anti-Freemason political party, a national party.
Correct. And that reminds us of how much more important Freemasonry used to be. Why was it so important?
And what is it? Probably many people don't even know what Masonry is.
So Masonic lodges or Masonic fraternities were notionally ancient, traced their histories back to
Solomon, right?
biblical times. But in practice, they really flourished in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries in Europe as well as in North America. And their significance lay partly in the fact that they allowed men from different classes to mix on an equal footing. So they have this important implicit egalitarianism. They're quasi-religious, but non-denominational. And they have their own complex set of social rules and practices. So initiation into the Masonic rite was a way into a different social order, which mattered a lot in a society like Russia's, with extremely elaborate hierarchies of aristocracy, a rather disrespected middle class, and a vast peasantry. So that's a much more important part of 18th and 19th century history than we mostly realize today. It's interesting the extent to which Freemasonry has been written out of historical narratives, but that's what you get from being a slightly secretive social order. If your archives aren't that accessible, they do exist, but they're not very accessible, then historians will tend to underplay your importance. I try to push back against this in a book called The Square and the Tower, which highlights the role of the Masonic lodges in the American Revolution. So if you were an educated man in the 19th century, you have this sort of range of possible philosophical avenues you can go down. You can embrace the ideas of the French Revolution. You can embrace their metamorphosis into the imperial ideal that Napoleon had come up with. Alternatively, you can embrace conservative reaction, which has a religious dimension. This was the path that Dostoevsky went down. You can become convinced that even Roman Catholicism is a dangerous deviation from the orthodox conservative way. Or you can go down the Masonic route. These were all different paths that a man could take: the political, secular, the religious, conservative, or the Masonic option. And there are others too. That Tolstoy himself ends up being a kind of religious fundamentalist, an ultra-pacifist, egalitarian, who influences, of all people, Mahatma Gandhi. One forgets that Tolstoy's influence reached in all kinds of extraordinary directions. But that's what makes War and Peace exciting. You're not only learning about the great upheavals of the Napoleonic period, but you're also learning about the intellectual options that were open to a thinking person who was trying to make sense of the human condition.
And the interplay between the intellectual, the philosophical, the idealistic, and the social, because it's not as though Masonry just provides the illumination for Pierre. He gets really involved in it, and he says, I realize there are 3 or 4 kinds of Masons. I think he says there are 4 kinds. I'm not sure if I might Rick Perry myself by forgetting all of them. But he says they're the mystical Masons. They're really interested in the esoteric teachings of the order that supposedly goes back to Adam, the prominence of King Solomon and all of this. Then there are those of us who want to do some good in the world. We want to act, we want to free the serfs, and we want political reforms, and we want all this. And then there are these social climbers, basically, who just, they're getting into it because they want to make connections with the other young, rich up-and-comers. And he starts to think, what am I spending my time and money on this for? I'm supposed to give all my money to these people. And he treats religion, Orthodox Christianity in this case, in much the same way. You see there's the cynical take on it where Prince Andre is making fun of these sweet, they're kind of like religious hippies in the old Russian sense of it. But then there's also, Tolstoy gives a quite sincere and I think dignified treatment to the role of religion in the character of Maria, this plain girl who has a very harsh father, who's the sister of Prince Andre. And so he's actually pretty fair and even on all of these aspects of human life, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yes, I think that's right. Tolstoy is not telling us that there's one correct path. He recognizes that different characters, different personalities are bound to embrace different philosophies. As we said earlier, the bad guys are bad not because they follow the wrong philosophy. They're bad because they're morally vacuous. Yep. But, you're making me think a little bit about how one might write War and Peace in our time. Would the Federalist Society be the equivalent of the Masonic orders in his time? I think if you think about it long enough, Michael, you'll be tempted to write your own War and Peace, and it will be the.
I could barely read War and Peace. Write my own.
But you might find it easier to write.
That's true.
Let's imagine that the setting. It's 1971. Let's just say, and your central character, your Pierre figure, has flirted with the radical left. He had a sort of 1968 moment, but by 1971 he's beginning to have doubts about Jane Fonda and the like, and he's beginning to flirt with Billy Graham, and he perhaps has some kind of religious epiphany. You can see where this might lead. That would be the first move of your central character, but that there would be others along the way. Your time span is going to probably take you into the 1980s. Perhaps he's an evangelical and a Reaganite by the end. So I think that the way in which Tolstoy is working here is intended to give us this extraordinary mixture of the philosophical and the literary, but at the heart of it is his own search for meaning, his own search for a correct way to live. And I think what makes Tolstoy an interesting figure is that, like Pierre, he just goes through different phases. He has the dissolute phase. He's a college dropout, Tolstoy. For those of you who have insecurity about your education, Tolstoy flames out at the University of Kazan, never finishes his studies, is a complete wastrel and a very dissolute individual, and only comes to literature after a period of military service. And the journey that Tolstoy is on goes far beyond War and Peace. He's still on this journey that ultimately leads him to a very ascetic Christian fundamentalism. That's what makes War and Peace exciting. The sense that although we get Pierre and Natasha happily married at the end, and we see what life is really all about.
Yep.
Love, family. It's a simple outcome. But you know that the author himself he's not arrived there. He would love to, but he's not going to.
It's not going to happen.
And the essay at the end offers the following insight. We think we have free will because things in the recent past seem to have been determined by our choices or the choices of others. And yet the things that are further in the past, the distant events, seem to have been determined and inevitable. And that's because we can't really imagine different histories that might have unfolded. So the past is deterministic, but the recent past, somehow we have agency. And Tolstoy's point is that must be an illusion. The recent past is also deterministic. Now, I don't believe that. And indeed, I think it was reading the essay and disagreeing with it that set me on the course to study history. I think there's always agency and there is free will. The problem is that everybody has it, from Napoleon down to the humble Russian serf. And history is just the net outcome of all these different decisions that people take as individuals. But it's Tolstoy's challenge to that view. It's Tolstoy's insistence that no, it's all deterministic, that from the minute Napoleon is born, it's inevitable that France will invade Russia and that Moscow will burn. That's where we land. That's his attempt to have one big idea. It's a failure. It's wrong, but you have to admire the ambition.
Right. And it does remind me a bit of the favorite game of all political conservatives, which is we like to pinpoint where exactly everything went wrong. You know, so we say it was the 1960s. No, now I say it's Obama. I don't know. Then it was the 1960s. No, it was the French Revolution. No, some would say it was the failure of the Jacobite Rising.
Or the Reformation.
So some would say the Reformation. Some would say, no, it was Duns Scotus or I don't know, Occam or something. And so we go all the way back. You say, I think it was actually when Eve ate the apple. That was the beginning of the end. But the point you're making on the distant past is deterministic, but the recent past could have gone a different way. He illustrates it in these battles where just, the French and the Russians make peace, and you got these Russians grumbling, we were this close. No, we had him. If we had held out a week longer, we would have run Napoleon off the edge of the earth. And you think, well, isn't that just the sort of thing you say when you've lost? Or maybe they're right. Actually, maybe, is it possible that they actually could have won?
I think what's great about War and Peace is that Tolstoy is able to give you a sense of the apparent contingency of events to people on the battlefield. Now, he's writing from a relative distance of 5 decades. His readers know that although the French get to Moscow and Moscow burns, that ultimately the Grande Armée is destroyed and Napoleon is defeated. They have that knowledge.
Yeah.
But what's great is the way Tolstoy gives you the sense that to the contemporaries, each battle is unpredictable and the outcomes hinge on contingencies. And the individual's fate, life or death in battle, that too appears contingent. So yeah, I think that's part of what I find compelling about the book. There's a great sense of immediacy in all that is being described. And somehow in the Battle of Borodino, for example, although we know what the outcome is, we get a sense of the complete confusion, the chaos of the experience of war to the individual, including Pierre himself, who finally gets mixed up in it in his sort of bumbling way.
He does show up finally.
He gets caught up in these historical events, and once you're in them, then you've no idea what the outcome will be. He ends up being a prisoner of the French and having to join the Grande Armée in the Great Retreat. And in that sense, he's just this little piece of flotsam on the great tide of history. The invasion of Russia is like a great tide. It comes in, it gets all the way to Moscow, and then it recedes. And that's part of what gives Tolstoy's argument about determinism a certain power.
And I see a parallel too, even in Tolstoy's description of the formality of the army, the way the army is structured. It's supposed to be. It's written down here on paper, and these are the ranks, and here's how. And then the reality, the informal hierarchies. I think it's Boris winds up among all of these muckety-mucks in the army, and he says, I realized once you kind of gain the relationships and confidences, and well, actually, I might nominally be underneath this person, but I kind of outrank him, and because I'm friends with this guy and this, and so maybe I could actually have an influence here, and maybe, for goodness sakes, maybe it's Rostov's trying to pass a letter to the emperor himself. Who cares about rank here? It's all there is there's an ebbing and a flowing and a little bit of a chaos in the war.
So hierarchies are tremendously important in the 19th century, and especially in Russia. There are elaborate distinctions between the members of the aristocracy. But as Tolstoy understands, social networks, which are informal, are more important. And so part of what we see in War and Peace is this interplay between formal hierarchies and the social networks, which are in many ways formed by decisions of a romantic nature. It's obvious that Rostov needs to marry a wealthy woman. He has no money. He's highly indebted. But no, he's going to make the wrong call because he is going to be true to his heart. Romantic love is really important, and we forget that it's not a universal phenomenon. The 19th century is the great age of romance. One reason that novels flourish as a genre in the 19th century is that there is this understanding that the course of true love is probably going to be at odds with the requirements of the hierarchy and of social convention. You could say that nearly all of 19th century literature is basically about that.
I mean, the word for novel is romance, romancy, roman, right? It's actually the same word.
And so in some ways, it's just a really big romance with a lot of love interest going on, and war is the exogenous shock that the various love affairs have to withstand. And I hope we don't make this sound an off-putting book. I'll have failed if I've done that. I think one enjoys War and Peace the way one enjoys Pride and Prejudice. It's just on a different scale, and yet at heart, at its core, it's a love story, and an extraordinarily moving one. I'm still kind of Pierre, and I'm still inclined to think of my wife Ayana as Natasha. In that sense, what makes War and Peace exciting is the love story is embedded in the great historical events of the time. And we may not want to admit it, but that will be true of most of our love stories if we take a step back. We can't abstract the passions of private life from the public domain particularly when they take the form of war. The great affairs of state impact the little affairs of love.
And you're making me think this might be why even though I don't like novels, why I liked it so much, is because it is this romance, but it's so perfectly woven in with real historical events that it reminds me of something about my own romantic love and the interpersonal, ordinary, seemingly trivial things that happen to me all happen within this historical context. I mean, even the interweaving of real historical figures, not just as the Tsar over here.
Which never feels forced.
It never feels forced.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because often if one's watching a movie and a real Winston Churchill suddenly enters, it just normally feels off no matter how well the actor plays the part. You never have a sense that there's something off. Even when Napoleon appears, part of what's brilliant about Tolstoy's skill as a writer is that the fictional and the factual are impossible to distinguish from one another. You do not see the join.
Yeah. And his observation, actually, that, looking close up, I mean, there are all of these descriptions of Napoleon who, in the early part of the novel, they're just so in awe of this man. They either hate him or they love him, and of the emperor, of the Tsar, and these grand figures that you almost like deities. And then he gets up close and says, Napoleon, he's just a guy. Yeah. He's just a guy, and he's got these legion of bodyguards. Interesting social observation. Maybe this is why celebrities surround themselves with a posse. It's not to protect themselves so much as to really puff themselves up. He says, but when you take away all the bodyguards and you just kind of look at the guy up close, he's just this like Corsican guy. It looks like you and me.
That's the brilliance of War and Peace. It's partly an enormous essay about the realities of greatness. And at a time when the United States has a great man as president and there's a great deal of reverence for him, it's good to read War and Peace and realize that when you actually are in the presence of the great man, he is just a man and fallible and full of human foibles. So Napoleon at the time Tolstoy is writing is a distant memory. At the time of the events he's describing, he is the towering figure, the most famous man in the world, the way that Donald Trump is today,
right? With
the ability to shape events all over the globe. So the interesting thing about what Tolstoy does is to start off with the proposition that everybody's life is an object of a sentence in which Napoleon is the subject. And yet, by the end, we realize, no, that's not actually what happened at all. Everyone had some agency, but in fact, historical processes were out of even Napoleon's control. So it's a book for our times in more ways than one. Yes, it's a book about war in Eastern Europe that's going on, but it's also a book about individual greatness. It's tempting to be overawed by the great man. But Tolstoy tells us that in truth, the great man's only great because we say he is.
Yeah.
Up close and personal, there's no profound difference between Napoleon and Pierre. It's just that one of them happens to be Emperor of France.
The parallels with our time you're impressing upon me are more marked than maybe they have been in recent decades. You've got this war in and around historical Russia, and you have this world historic figure as the most important leader in the world, which you don't always have as the president of the United States.
Also, a great sense of moral and ideological confusion.
Yeah.
I'm struck by the fact that many people today, I see this amongst young people at the University of Austin, are in search of some philosophical path, some meaning. They're not content with atheistical materialism, which is, I guess, the kind of legacy of the boomers. And some find a path on the way to religion. Yeah,
a lot, a shocking number just within the last few years.
Terrific signs of religious revival amongst Christian and Jewish students. But one also sees the attractions of partisan politics, where political ideologies are hardening into faiths, secular religions. So I think if one reads War and Peace today, it somehow rings more plausibly than when I read it first in the 70s. We're in a more War and Peace world today than when I was a student.
And when you try to, I'm going back even to your summary, which was extraordinarily well done in the beginning, hard thing to do to summarize this whole book, but Tolstoy gives a summary in the epilogue. And he says, let me tell you about this. Here's the historical summary. There's this guy named Napoleon, and he decided that he comes out of the revolution and he gets all of this power, and he's very good at killing people. And he goes to Africa and he kills people, and he kills a lot of them. So then he realizes, wow, I could probably kill people in Europe too. So he goes around and kills a bunch of people in Europe, and he says, I think I'm going to go kill people in Russia too. And he kills all these, his own people die, and then all of these people die in Russia, and he just keeps on killing them because he's really good at it, and he can do it. And that's going to make him great. And glory is a big, important theme in the novel too. And that's it. And then he gets to the end of that description and he says, you think I'm being cute. But I'm not, I don't really mean to be cute. I'm just, that's a way to read it. And this is another way to read it. The thing you've just spent 1,200 pages reading, that's another way to read it too. They're both accurate.
Yeah. Tolstoy was appalled by the violence of war. What he saw in Crimea and the siege of Sevastopol greatly shocked him. And you get that also in War and Peace, when particularly when at the Battle of Borodino, prisoners have been killed, Pierre thinks he's going to be executed.
Yeah.
Brushes with death are important in War and Peace. Glimpses of one's own mortality, they really focus the mind. So this is part of what makes the book powerful. If one hasn't contemplated one's own mortality, even in a car accident, one hasn't fully understood how precarious life is. But life is very precarious in time of war. Nobody in Ukraine needs to have this explained to them, but maybe people in California could do with reading about this. Because one of the things that's striking about our time is that war is much more proximate than most people realize. This is an odd feature of American life. We act as if war happens far, far away, never to us unless we opt to go to it. But actually the weapons of the 21st century make war highly accessible to even people living in the American heartland. I don't think that has ever fully sunk in this country.
Yeah.
That you may not be interested in War and Peace, but War and Peace are interested in you, and they are more able to impact your life than at any time in American history. This is why Americans need to read War and Peace, because you need to be prepared for the Battle of Borodino to happen inside the borders of the United States.
Because the self-understanding of the United States in the 90s, perhaps this has been overstated even, is that history had ended, the world's flat now, and we're all in a community of nations, liberalism is one, we're good.
Plus we're exceptional.
We're exceptional.
In addition, we're exceptional. And ocean here, ocean there, Canada up, Mexico down, we're all good. Look at the range of Chinese and Russian missiles. Consider the implications of hypersonic missiles and space wars. The truth is that this country is far more vulnerable than at any time in its history to war, including war with Russia, though I'm personally a good deal more worried about war with China. So War and Peace is far more relevant now than it was a generation ago, when the probability of war on our doorstep was lower, unless it was just thermonuclear war and oblivion. So I'm hoping that I, in the course of this conversation, have aroused enough interest in viewers and listeners that they'll go and read War and Peace and ask themselves the key question: who am I? Who am I in this book? Which character is me? The thing about the great cast of characters and the range from good to bad to ugly is that really all different personality types are in War and Peace.
Yeah.
And you'll encounter yourself at some point in this book. And warning, it may not be entirely flattering, because Tolstoy's not entirely kind to many characters in the book. Maybe there are a few exceptions, but most characters get something of the unvarnished treatment. So part of the beauty of the scale of the book is that you're unlikely to read it without encountering yourself at some point.
Yeah. Even when you look at yourself, and even as you've changed, you might say, when I was a boy, I was like him, and I'm older, I'm more like this character. This is something that hits me on a broader point on history in itself. And he is writing a philosophy of history, or attempting to. There are so many moments when they say everything changed. And Pierre is looking up at the sky, or Andre is looking up at the sky. Or when Pierre meets the Freemason, or when the little girls meet, all the various men, everything changed. Even here by the end, you've gone through so many of these moments, and then page 1211 in the Oxford World Classics. Everything, her face, walk, look, and voice was suddenly altered. To her own surprise, a power of life and hope of happiness rose to the surface and demanded satisfaction. And there's so many passages like this throughout the novel. And I wonder if he's insisting upon this as we talk about how our own conception of our country is changing, how our own conception of our country's history is changing. If this is not a comment on history, and if this is not even in part why Tolstoy has to write a novel like this, because even our understanding of history is changing. Even history itself is in flux throughout the story and throughout time.
Although Tolstoy ends with this deterministic philosophy that all history is somehow one pre-programmed narrative, in truth, that's not what War and Peace seems to me to be telling us.
Right.
What War and Peace is telling us is that the historical process is too complex to model. That the professors in the government department can labor night and day. They will never produce an equation that captures the historical process because it's particles with consciousness. And as they all interact, making their own decisions, actuated perhaps by some wrong philosophy or by some temporary passion, the net result is this huge ebb and flow that leads the French to invade Russia and then to retreat in disarray. So I read the book in a very different way from Tolstoy's second epilogue. I read it as the most successful attempt to capture the complexity of the historical process. And that complexity arises from the fact that what we call history is the sum of all the loves and hates, the parties, the duels, all the little things of the individual's life, of family lives. They sum together and net out to history. And in that process, we all have agency. But because we all have agency, nobody has absolute power. Not even the towering figures of our time.
Your point on particles with consciousness and how you can't really predict it. You can't all models are bad. Some models are useful. You really can't map these things. I even think, we can't even do it with particles, actually. You think of the three-body problem, right. Chaos. At a very small scale, you lose track of these things very, very quickly. And so, the only solution is this. So you have to read it. Did you get the message? Do you think they got the message, Neil?
I hope these particles have enough consciousness to read War and Peace.
Sir Neil Ferguson, I always say thank you, sir, to my male guests. But for you, I can actually say, I can really mean it. Neil, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Michael. My pleasure.
Thank you to all of you. Read it. War and Peace. I'm Michael Knowles. See you next time on the Book Club. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Book Club on PragerU. PragerU is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we rely on donations from viewers like you to keep this content on the air. Please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today to help keep this content coming. Thank you very much.